Calculative utilitarianism and consequentialism seem to dominate our ethics and morality. Do you see a problem with this?
When we come to look at ethics as it is often understood today, particularly in our universities, one finds that there's a difficulty in figuring out how to evaluate what is good ethically. And the answer that has often been found seems to me to lead rather away from a good disposition, which is what surely morality consists in, towards a calculative way of thinking, which is almost the opposite of the way that a moral person would think. Not to make a calculation of what's going to happen here, but to realize that certain things call to us to act in a certain way. Interestingly, there's a book, I can't remember the title of it, but I can tell you the author of it, by Heidi Raven, on morality. And she describes interviewing people in France who sheltered Jews during the Nazi occupation. And when asked why they did it, at great risk to themselves because they could end up in concentration camps, their answer was, I don't know how I decided to do it. There was no way I could not do it. Now, that seems to me to be a true way of understanding many a moral decision. But you get in utilitarianism, which is the typical way in which ethics tends to be presented in academe in the West these days, the idea that actions are valued by their utility, the ones that caused enough good to happen. It still leaves one wondering, well, how do you know what is good? But there we go. As Lessing pointed out in the 18th century, the problem for the utilitarian is, well, useful for what? And that calls into question, what is this use about? And then you have to start tackling other values, such as goodness, beauty, and truth that lie beyond. But if you think in terms of utility, and if you think in terms of consequentialism, the outcome of an action as deciding its value, its moral value, then you get into problems. And I quote one thought experiment, which is that people are asked a question which concerns a scenario in which two women are out together having a coffee, and one puts what she thinks is sugar into her friend's coffee, but unfortunately it's poison and her friend dies. That's the first scenario. In the second scenario, the two women are out for a coffee together, and the woman puts into her friend's coffee what she thinks is poison, but in fact it turns out to be sugar and she lives. Now, when people are asked in the normal state what they think is the more immoral action, they don't go by the consequences, they go by the intent. So obviously it was more immoral to intend to kill the friend than to have made a mistake. But with the right temporoparietal junction temporally suppressed, which can be done in a painless way using transcranial magnetic stimulation, people answered the question in a consequentialist way, that the worse action was the one that resulted in the death of the friend. And there are even more dramatic ones. One is a doctor has a number of patients on waiting lists for transplants of 5 different organs. And one day a patient comes in for a checkup, and he notes that this healthy patient would act as a donor for all 5 of his patients who are going to die if they can't find a donor. So should he not kill this patient in order to make 5 other patients live? Well, if you really think that that's what we expect from an ethical doctor, then I think you've probably got a problem with the way in which you're assessing a moral act. So for me, utilitarianism is a non-starter. It would be a horrifying thought if one made decisions on what to do on the basis of a calculus. So what I am also not terribly keen on is what is called deontology. The deon bit is nothing to do with deus in Latin, God. It is the Greek word deon, meaning a duty. So This is a Kantian position, and Kant thought that there were moral imperatives, famously, and that these imperatives were, as it were, rules. So there were certain things that you never do because they're immoral, and certain things that you do or maximize the amount of doing them because they are moral. The trouble with that is that circumstances often change, and he himself was aware that a thing and its opposite can be derived sometimes from the same set of propositions. He had famously 4 antinomies, which were examples of deducing 2 opposite positions from the same starting point. So that is not what I'm particularly myself persuaded by, but more virtue ethics, which is about the cultivation in the person of, again, a disposition which guides that person towards actions which can be defended as moral. While we're on the topic, I just think it's interesting that I'm not alone in this, that I would assess that the left hemisphere is quintessentially not interested in morals, and indeed utilitarianism may be its way of substituting a calculus for something that it doesn't really understand, namely morality, whereas the right hemisphere is where we make true judgments about the morality of actions and which motivates us towards a moral outcome.
You have suggested that the transcendental values of truth, beauty, and goodness have been debased or destroyed by our contemporary culture.
Yes, what I mean about those core values being somehow destroyed or debased is, well, let's look at them one by one. It's, first of all, fairly clear that truth is something that has been problematized, as people now say, to the point where a lot of people think that there is no truth, it's just whatever I make it up to be. Now that seems to me to be a deeply wrong, indeed immoral position. I think it's understandable because of certain things that have happened in the university during my lifetime. So when I was in Oxford as an undergraduate in the early 1970s, in the English faculty that I was studying in, there were a couple of important figures and a couple of important influences who were Marxist and who saw everything as needing to be decoded through a belief that in effect there was no truth, it was just whatever the class that had power wanted to make out was the case. And I thought that was very wrong, but also at the same time a very limiting way of thinking about a work of art, not to approach it openly for what it has to tell us, but to go to it with a preconceived idea of what value would mean, that it would expose the supposed deceit in the nature of truth altogether. But there was also the beginnings of deconstructionism, and again a belief that there was no single truth, there's just everybody's truth. And so, as I've already mentioned, I believe that truth certainly does exist, but it isn't a single certainty. It is something that we approach more like a picture coming into focus than a journey that comes to end at the end of a path that we follow, and that everybody will acknowledge as being the truth once it's reached. So, I think we've done a lot of harm, and since then a lot of other isms have sprung up in universities, other ways of avoiding reading and enjoying a work of art by coming to it with a checklist of propositions that you believe are important and effectively the moral positions, and if they don't measure up to those, then you're going to criticize the work of art for not being whatever it is enough. And of course, in broader society, we see, and I'm speaking at 3 months into President Trump's second term of office, we see a very interesting, let me put it that way, reinterpretation of what truth might be. Truth is what serves. And so again, I think truth has been debased to utility and power, what makes us feel powerful, what gives us utility to promulgate a certain set of ideas. So in a way, instead of that being a characteristic of truth at its best, it's a characteristic which was denied by the Marxists and the deconstructionists and the feminists and all the rest. And it's really more a description of their own philosophies, interestingly, that they are the ones that make the truth conform to a theory that they have already decided is the truth. Then we do look at goodness. Well, again, utilitarian calculus seems to be widespread as a way of making a decision about what is good. Beyond that, putting it bluntly, ticking various boxes is praised as being good, and it may not be good at all. It may not be good for anybody, but this is the way we now, in a simplistic fashion, have restructured our idea of what good is. And I would say that what is true and what is good are things that you can detect in a person from their relationship to the world at large, and beyond the world to the cosmos, and to nature and to other human beings. In other words, it is once again a relational matter. It's not a thing. It is a disposition, not a proposition. And so then we come to beauty, and well, it's very obvious that in my lifetime, and starting probably 40 years before I was born, there began a movement of raising things that are ugly and absurd to the status of works of art. I mean, it begins with Duchamp's urinal, effectively, and goes forward through many such efforts, except they're pretty much effortless, and which are masquerading as art, whereas art is a sacred thing because it is the place in which we can further the existence of beauty, and without beauty we are starved and impoverished individuals. So part of what fulfills us is the coming into the presence of something beautiful, which great works of art bring us. Fortunately, at least for now, there is no impediment in us still appreciating very great works of art from other eras. And one thing I'd like to say on the positive is that I think that in the recent history of music, as in the recent history of biology, people are beginning to see the importance of developing a less materialistic and a less nihilistic approach to each of those. I mean, that they're very distinct, of course, but it is wonderful to find there are great, and there always were a few great composers, and there are more of them now, I think, composing, and art, apart from duct taping a banana to the wall, has become once again more intelligent and more redolent of the beautiful. So I think this conceptualizing of what is art takes us away once again from our instinctual being, from our embodied being, from the bit of us that knows more than our mind. Schopenhauer said, there is something in us that is wiser than our mind. And I think that is where art speaks to us. It's where all the great mythologies of all the civilizations and even cultures that we know speak to us. And I think that in my lifetime they've been reduced to mechanistic calculations, from attempts to shock and disturb. They've been turned into matters that starve us rather than feed us. And I again would like to say that the idea that art is what is considered beautiful is simply the product of a culture. I'd like to finesse that and say, yes, what is praised as and produced as beautiful in a culture if it's any good, will probably be different from other works of art from other cultures, but they will complement one another in a beautiful way, which means that we don't have a difficulty in understanding them. I think most Westerners would agree that the products of Japanese and Chinese aesthetics are colossally beautiful. And there is no difficulty for the Japanese and Chinese coming to the West and going to, for example, the National Gallery and finding the art of the West extraordinarily beautiful. They love our literature. We can love, and do, in my case, love their literature, and so on. There isn't a problem here. There's a beautiful clip from, I think, was it the 90s or sometime like that, made by some French anthropologists who went to talk to a group of forest dwellers in Brazil, and they showed them footage on a laptop of various things that happened in the West. And their response to pretty much every one of these was one of shock and amazement that we were doing things that, you know, showed them a formal French garden and said, but the trees don't wish to be tormented in this way. They wish to, when we cut a tree, we ask for forgiveness from the tree for what we are doing, and so on. And, you know, they saw what old people's homes, they said, we would never do that to our elderly. We look after them, we nourish them, we cherish them. Landing on the moon, and they were saying, but this is not something we should do. The moon is disturbed by this. Now, whatever you think, their attitude was, the things you are doing are not things that please us. And then there was a clip of Maria Callas singing Casta Diva from Bellini, and Bellini's Norma, and the whole group of them are completely transfixed. And when it's finished, an elder says, we do not understand it, it is not our culture, but this is to us extremely beautiful. And then a young man says again something of the same kind. It's not our way of expressing ourselves, but we see this as saying something very, very spiritual, very true.
Certain philosophers seem to be of particular importance in the development of your thought. For example, the phenomenologist Max.
There are many things that I love about Max Scheler, who was an early 20th century phenomenological philosopher, admired greatly by Heidegger, who gave his funeral oration and called him the most important philosopher in Europe in his time. He describes a phenomenon that is best translated into English, we don't have a word for it, as value-ception. In other words, our ability to receive, pick up, tune into, respond to value as a primary element of our experience. So he argues that we don't have to know everything in a valueless way and then come to a decision almost by weighing up what we think and then attribute a value. But one of the early stages of our reception of any object of our attention is that there is value attributed. So we pick up the value of something and we may fine-tune and even reverse that decision, but we don't ever operate without there being value. So he puts the point that not only is value primary because it's something in the cosmos, as I believe, that we either respond to or don't, but that actually in temporal order of our coming to know anything, it comes earlier, not later. It's not painted on after we've come to an assessment of something, but it is part of our initial take on something. That is particularly lovely because it expresses the way in which in experience one often is seized by the beauty of something immediately before one is aware of a full description of it at any other level. Shaler's understanding of values is also very interesting in another respect. So he thought that all values were not equal. He thought there were different tiers or ranks of values. And I sometimes illustrate this with a pyramid in which at the bottom there is the level of the values of utility and pleasure only. That, I believe, is representative of the sort of society we now inhabit, where our reasons for doing things are those of increasing our power or increasing our pleasure, but ultimately simply of doing what's useful. The next level up is that of what he called Lebenswerte, which means values of life. And by those he meant the values of such things as honor, decency, magnanimity, generosity, selflessness, and other things that I believe are rarer today than they perhaps were once in societies that believed these values were very important ones to follow. The next level up is what he called geistige Werte, and Geist in German means both intellect and spirit, which is interesting. So these are effectively the Platonic values of beauty, goodness and truth. And then right at the apex of the pyramid is das Heilige, which means the holy. Now, what is intriguing here is that I believe in our society we have inverted his pyramid. So at the peak is utility and pleasure. Below that come all those things like beauty, goodness and truth, which, yes, okay, priests and philosophers may talk about, but really we don't bother with them much anymore. And I must say that in my lifetime I feel they've been rather neglected, but that's something we can come back to if we wish. Then below that are those values of really of an upright, decent, compassionate character, a trustworthy character, and those are just the values espoused by the gullible and makes them useful to the Machiavellian so that they can exploit them. And right at the bottom is Das Heilige, which only exists because there's a caste of priests who want to have power and influence over the masses. So the way we've been taught to think of it has inverted this pyramid. But if we see the pyramid the right way up, it seems to me a wonderful way of understanding what one intrinsically, instinctively, intuitively gets from experience, or at least I have got from my experience, and many other people whose writings I'm aware of have done so too.